What's going on, guys? My name is Randall. I make tutorials and videos on painting shoes or anything else for the matter. If this is something you like to see, feel free to leave a like, subscribe below. I promise you won't regret it. So today, just want to do a real easy tutorial on how to start painting shoes, or if you're thinking about painting shoes, what supplies you may need. This is just a basic general list just for someone that might want to pick this up due to, I don't know, being bored because you can't go anywhere right now. But yeah, this will just be a quick and easy tutorial. No like B-roll edits or anything like that. I'll just be showing you how I prep, paint, and finish the shoes. Just a real basic, easy colorway. Just like this. I'll just be painting the other one. And just throwing in some tips and tricks I've learned along the way. But just to further clarify, these are for Air Force 1's or any leather material. If you use canvas like Vans or something else, it'll be a little bit different. But yeah, these are for Air Force 1's. So let's just hop right into it. Okay, now. So first off, let's go over some of the supplies that are needed to paint shoes. First off, obviously need a pair of shoes. In this case, we're using a pair of nice crispy Air Force 1's. Next is the paint that you use. Now, I personally use Angelus paint. It can get a little pricey, but whatever paint you're using, just make sure that it is acrylic paint, as that is the best paint to adhere to most types of materials that you'll be using with shoes. Of course, you'll need paintbrushes to actually paint these shoes. Of course, there's other options as well. I know some people use spray paint, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend depending on what kind of project you're doing. But in the other case, you could also use acrylic paint with airbrushes. Airbrushes do go for a lot more money than paintbrushes, but if this is something serious you're looking into, then I would highly recommend it at a later point. For the video I'm showing you, I'm not using any tape, but tape is definitely recommended, especially if this is one of the first times you are painting shoes. You could use it to mask off any areas. That way you don't have to be as precise as not using paint. It's a lot easier to clean up. There are downsides, of course, but we'll get into that as well. Another material you need is acetone. This helps clean off the factory finish of the shoe. That way the paint can stick and adhere to whatever material you're using a lot better. You could apply this with any cotton balls, swabs. An old rag is also really good. Just make sure any of the residue that the cotton balls or the rag leaves on the shoe, just make sure you clear that all off before. That way it doesn't interrupt your painting. And lastly, you need some kind of finisher. I use this Angelus matte finisher. You can also use a spray that I have right here. I personally like the finisher better, that you use a paintbrush to paint on it. That way it's more controllable and you know that you have fully covered all the things you need to cover with the paintbrush, as opposed to just spraying it everywhere. But either option is still good nonetheless. Okay, so to start customizing your shoes, first thing, obviously, if you don't want to get paint on your laces, you need to take your laces off. Pretty self-explanatory, especially if you're going to be painting around the eyelets and whatnot. After that, this is where the acetone comes in. So this part is very crucial and important to painting shoes, because if you don't clear off all the factory finish, all that finisher that the company puts on there, the paint won't stick, it won't last, and it will crack, and it just will look booty. So make sure to put this on every single time before you start a shoe with leather. Of course, if it's canvas, you don't need to prep it, but in this case with an Air Force 1, it is leather material, so make sure you do prep it properly. What I do here is I just take a cotton ball, I take acetone and pour it on it. Just make sure your ball is nice and moist, all with that acetone all over it. And then pretty much just anywhere you're going to paint, just have to rub it over with acetone. I like to do it a couple times. I like to do everywhere that I might paint on, in case I change my mind in the future. That way I don't have to come back and do this part again. But just make sure you do a very thorough job with this. Just because if you rush through this part, it will mess up your whole project and it won't last. And that's not what we're looking for, is it? So take your time with this. Make sure you do a thorough job just to make sure that it gets done correctly. You don't want to spend 3, 4, 5, 10 hours painting a shoe and then it starts to crack after a couple wears. That's just not ideal as possible. So just make sure you do a very good job with this part. So once you got all that all prepped up, this is the time where you start painting. So I already mixed some navy together, made it a little bit lighter, but it was already pre-mixed, so I have that all ready to go. From here on forward, this is just painting. And if you're using a brush, there are a lot of different paint brushes you can use and a lot of techniques on how wet you need to get the brush or how moist you need to get the brush, or like how much paint you get before you start laying it on your canvas or shoe or whatnot. That's something that you can make a whole video on, and a lot of techniques you can look up online as well. It's probably too much to explain through this video. I like the angled brush that I'm currently using. I think later in the video I switched to a smaller head for the swoosh, just because the angle brush I have is a little bit bigger for some of the smaller areas. This just takes practice. Your first time painting, you're not going to be a freaking Picasso over here or anything like that. It just takes time. One thing I do want to stress is that it takes a whole lot of patience painting, especially with the amount of coats that you have to do and just making sure that you get every single part covered, because especially if you're going to be giving these to friends, selling to clients or anything like that, you don't want some splotchy, half woody type work setting out to any people that will be wearing these, because it's just a bad representation of the product that you make and it just won't go well. So just make sure you take your time with this. When I paint, especially with lighter colors, you do need to add more layers just to make sure that, one, everything's covered, like I said before, but two, also your first couple layers, there will be brush strokes left over. It won't be as perfect of a finished product as you would like. And like I said, it just takes patience, it just takes time. So here, I'm pretty much done with my first layer. Of course, ideally you want to add thin, smooth layers, because that way it allows the paint to dry evenly. But like I said before, that just takes practice, that just takes time. One thing I did not mention in the beginning is another item that you can use is a hair dryer. You can see that right now. That's what I grabbed and that's what I'm using. For this, use a lower heat, just make sure it's always moving. Same situation, just take your time with it. 15-20 seconds should be fine, of course depending on how much you're drying, but just make sure that it doesn't stay still and you use a low heat. So right now I think I'm 3 to 4 layers in on the Nike swoosh. Of course my hand isn't as steady as I would like to be all the time, and of course paint splatters occasionally if you're not careful enough. Me in this situation, I'm not always careful as much as I do try to be, but this is where the quality of your work stands out, and just making sure that everything is as clean and crispy as possible. The way that I always use to clean up paint is use either a cotton ball or a cotton swab, dip it in some acetone, and just take the paint right off. For this, just make sure whatever part you're rubbing with the cotton ball is completely covered with acetone, because if it's not, then the dry parts of the cotton ball will smear the paint over the shoe, and just make sure it's on the moist part of the cotton ball so it can just disappear. So I just cut to where I am done with the swooshes, just because it's probably pretty boring watching all that swoosh work. So I'm on to a new paint. One thing I did not show, which I probably should have, is how to clean your brushes in between colors. Of course, like I said earlier about the types of brushes, you can look all this up online as well, but just make sure you clean it off very cleanly, because if you still have navy blue and then you dip it in the light blue and then it becomes a regular blue, then you have some problems and then your color gets all messed up. And for someone that's colorblind like me, just figuring out what color paint you need in the first place is hard enough. It just makes it even harder if you mix all your paints up. So just make sure you clean it off very well. I'll just touch on this now. After you're done painting your shoe for the day, make sure you clean off your brush very, very well. Don't have any paint on the brush, and make sure you form it the way that you want it to form, which is flat and very straight lines on your brush, just to preserve your brush as long as possible. Paintbrushes can get a little pricey. I don't have expensive ones, but the more you take care of it, the more it will last. But anyways, back to the shoe. I'm using a quote-unquote pale blue. It's kind of like Columbia blue or Carolina blue if you so choose. But it's a very similar situation. What I personally like to do is to paint top layers first and then bottom layers after. That way, if some paint gets on the bottom layer and it's a darker color underneath, I can just paint over it. Don't really have to clean up. But in this case, it is a lighter color, so that's why I still cleaned up regardless. But one thing I do want to mention, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the earlier part of the video, if you are using a lighter color, it usually does take more layers to make sure that your paint strokes don't show and just to make it as smooth and clean as possible. So I think for all the light blue that I did on the shoe, I think I did something somewhere around 3 to 4 coats, as it turned out pretty well in that amount, but it could change from time to time. Sometimes I might only use 2, sometimes I might do like 6 or 7. It kind of just depends on how you want it to look and how it turns out. So very situational. But yeah, for Air Force Ones, there's different sections, of course, like there's a part below the swoosh, part above the swoosh. Of course, if you paint them different colors, this could change, but since I'm all painting them the same color, I kind of painted the same exact way. I like to go in sections just because once I get a good, clean paint job on one section, I can use that as reference for the other panels just to make sure that all the colors do line up, because sometimes when you put on a layer and then you dry it, of course the color does change a little bit and you do have to wait for it to set in a little bit as well. So just doing one panel at a time seems to work for me. Of course, that's just me and I'm a weirdo, so you can take that with a grain of salt. You can use that or you can do your own way. Doesn't really matter. There is more than one way to paint a shoe. This is just how I do it, and that has worked for me so far. Okay, now at this point, I'm probably 2 to 3 hours in on the shoe. Like I said, it does take a while. You do need to be patient, even for a basic design like this, if you do want it to turn out well. And sometimes when you're like 3, 4, 5, 69 layers in, you're like, damn, I just want this shoe to be over with. I mean, even if the paint job's done, you still gotta make sure that you finish it correctly, just because, like I said, the same thing with prep. If you don't prep it correctly, the shoe will crack, the paint will wear off, a bunch of other reasons, and it's the same with the finisher as well. So in this case, I'm going to use the Angelus Matte Acrylic Finisher. Like I said earlier, I like this better than the spray just because it's more controllable and you know which parts of the shoe the finisher gets on for sure. That way there's no questions, no concerns about it. Once you slap that on there, 1 to 2 coats depending on how you're feeling that day, it'll make sure that the paint lasts for as long as possible. For the most part, this is somewhat weather resistant as well. Resistance. But with some sort of shoe, the shoe lasts as long as you do take care of it. Of course, if it rains, the paint will hold up, but I don't recommend, you know, a freaking tsunami coming through and you're like, oh, let me toss on my Air Force Ones and I'm good to go. No, the tsunami might alter the color of the shoe. It might F up the paint. It might do a lot. You know why? Because it's a freaking tsunami, okay? If you take care of the shoes will take care of you. I don't even know why I said that. I don't even know if that's relevant right now, but you get the point. Just be smart with your shoes. If you take care of them, they'll always look crispy as boo. So actually getting to applying this finisher now. So you can start by dipping your paintbrush in. This will probably be the same thing as when you're first starting out with actually painting. You don't want too much paint, but it is something that you will feel out over time. Just making sure you don't get too much, because if you get too much, then you'll have to move it from one area to the other, and then you don't want it to get clumpy, and just making sure that you do a nice thin layer. The way that I like to see it is like once you see that glimmer, like a glimmer coat on the paint, that's when you know it's on there, and just making sure that you spread that as evenly as possible across your entire shoe, or if you just want to do the painted parts, you can do that as well. In this part on the swoosh, when I first got the finisher out, I just slapped it all on the swoosh. Highly don't recommend that. If you see, I keep going back to it and trying to spread that all out. Yes, I messed up. Yes, I'm not perfect. So what? Bite me, okay? So same kind of strokes as when you're painting. You can use a bigger brush for this, as of course it will cover more surface. The more surface area you cover with the brush, the less amount of movement you need, and that's a bunch of geometry that I took in like 7th grade and I don't want to talk about it. But pro tip, even though it's a matte finisher, it still comes off a little shiny. It has a little glimmer to it, If you do want to mat it out even more, if you want to mat it, does that make sense? If you want to dull it out even more, there's a product I use by Angelus as well. It's called Duller. Nice. Where you could put a little bit of Duller into a cup and then add your finisher on it. Probably like a drop of Duller for the amount of matte you would use for a whole shoe. And it just dulls it out so it has even less glimmer for a matte finish, even though a matte finish isn't supposed to have glimmer, but you know, that's a whole nother story. And yeah, so here's the finished product. If it will focus for 1 second. Okay. Yeah, so see, there's still a little bit of shine to it. It is fresh finisher though, so keep that in mind. You do have to let things dry, things settle in, so keep that in mind. So that's pretty much it. Just keep in mind that this is just the absolute basics on like materials and steps to paint shoes, just making sure that the paint does last, not only through wear, but through weather and everything like that as well. If you want to do more like intricate designs or patterns, of course, there will be extra steps and more precautions or techniques that you need to take into account. But this is just a real easy way to just change up the look on shoes, especially a pair like Air Force 1's. You can really do anything you want with these. If this video helped you at all, feel free to leave a like down below and subscribe for more videos. This is my first tutorial. I usually do other sneaker videos with like B-roll and editing and all that, but I just want to get this out just as this was a pretty simple shoe and just help anyone that might be interested in doing something during this time. But yeah, make sure to subscribe below. I'll be trying to come out with as many videos as possible. At least try to get out like one with every shoe I make. But I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!